Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's talk. This event has proven extremely popular, so it's a real pleasure to welcome so many new viewers to this Zoom session. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bethany Gaunt, and I'm Associate Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. The centre was set up several years ago by Lady Esther Gilbert and Sir Harry Solomon to honour Sir Martin's legacy and try and follow in his footsteps to bring history alive for all. We offer talks on a range of subjects linked to Sir Martin's research fields, as well as sessions and resources for secondary school history teachers. Now, many, if not all of you joining tonight will be familiar with Martin Gilbert's name, since he was Winston Churchill's official biographer, as well as the author of many other brilliant books on the UK's most famous Prime Minister and other 20th century topics. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome Lady Esther Gilbert, who joins us from Canada. Esther, whose own research background is in the Holocaust, encountered Sir Martin through his writing, and she continues to work tirelessly to ensure that Sir Martin's staggering 88 books are kept in print and accessible for new generations of scholars. I would encourage you all to visit the website martingilbert.com, which is a superb source of information about Sir Martin's extensive works, and where you can sign up for Esther's monthly newsletter, in which she shares excerpts of his writing. I'll post a link in the chat in just a minute. Tonight, Lady Esther will be reading from her late husband's lecture for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. There'll be time for questions at the end, so please, as always, post those in the chat, either publicly or privately to me if you prefer, and we'll get through as many as possible at the end of the talk. Thank you so much for giving up your time to share this work with us tonight, Esther. I will now hand over to you.
Thank you, Bethany, and welcome to everyone. Last summer, I attended a webinar from a noted Holocaust organization on the question of the bombing of Auschwitz. The talk basically said that Churchill knew and let the matter drop, inferring, I guess, that it was Churchill's fault that the railway lines weren't bombed. I was quite upset and wrote an angry email. And then I wondered what Martin would do and realized he would just stick to his writing and present the real history. So after deleting my email, I got in touch with the center and suggested a talk in January in advance of the International Holocaust Memorial Day on Churchill and the Holocaust. As I was looking through Martin's books to find readings, I got an email from Cyril Mazansky, who's involved with the International Churchill Society. Cyril wrote that he was going through Martin's books, which had warm inscriptions to him, and he remembered introducing Martin at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum when Martin spoke on Churchill and the Holocaust. I immediately asked whether he had any of Martin's materials, lecture notes, and he said Richard Langworth had published it. Richard Langworth, who is a gold mine of information on Churchill, told me where he'd published it, and there I found it on my bookshelf. Going through it, I realized that Martin had hit all of the key points in his succinct and thoughtful style. So rather than reading from many of his books, I'd like to read the lecture and show you the books in which Martin recorded and developed these points. Let me just see if I can do this. Now I've lost it. Hold on. Sorry. I seem to have lost my PowerPoint. It's never without its glitches, is it? Okay. Now I just need to get you back. I'm sorry. Share screen. Oops. Are we on? Ah, success. Thank you for your patience. So here we are. It was a 50-minute speech, so please take a cup of tea or a glass of wine and make yourselves comfortable. would also like to say before I begin that I believe there are people here, members here from the International Churchill Society who attended this lecture and are here for the second reading. I hope you'll enjoy. Churchill and the Holocaust, the possible and impossible. Martin says, I would like in the next 50 minutes to look at an aspect of Churchill's life which has always concerned me as a historian of Churchill, as a historian of the Holocaust, and as a Jew. Every biographer tries to find the key to his subject's personality, and above all, the flaws and weaknesses which are an indispensable part of any biographical presentation. I remember how pleased, actually thrilled I was some years ago, talking to one of those who had been close to Churchill in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. He said to me, you have to understand, Gilbert, that Winston did have one serious fault. As a biographer, my ears pricked up and my pen was poised to record and then to follow this up. This gentleman continued. He was too fond of Jews. Whether this was a serious fault for some of his contemporaries or as biographer, it was an extraordinary window into his life. When in November 1932, shortly before Hitler came to power, and Churchill was in Munich doing some historical research about the first Duke of Marlborough, his ancestor, an intermediary tried to get him to meet Hitler, who was in Munich at the time and had high hopes of coming to power within months. Churchill agreed to meet Hitler, who was going to come to see him in his hotel in Munich, and said to the intermediary, there are a few questions you might like to put to him, which can be the basis of our discussion when we meet. Among them was the following question. What is the sense of being against a man simply because of his birth? How can any man help how he is born? This may seem like a simple sentiment to us now, but how many people, distinguished people from Britain, the United States, and other countries who met or might have met Hitler, raised that question with him. So surprised and possibly angered was Hitler by this question that he declined to come to the hotel and see Churchill. From the moment that Hitler came to power, Churchill in his public speeches and in his parliamentary speeches made it clear that the racial aspect of Nazism was a central concern. He always insisted on raising this issue and pointing out the relevance to his listeners of the Nazi racial policies, and this he did again and again. I also found an article which he wrote in April 1933, some 2 months after Hitler came to power, an extraordinary forecast or foresight, the recognition which I haven't seen elsewhere at the time, that it was not only the 500,000 Jews of Germany, but many other Jews, many millions of Jews elsewhere who were now threatened. This is what he wrote. There is a danger of the odious conditions now ruling in Germany being extended by conquest to Poland and another persecution and pogrom of Jews being begun in this new area. Churchill saw the anti-Jewish policies of the Nazis as affecting every element, not only of German life, but of the relationship between Germany and the other powers. He spoke of them at a time when Jewish reaction was being debated strongly by Jews themselves. Should the Jews boycott? Should the Jews lobby? As you know from the American experience, the Jewish community was divided as to how it should, or if it should, represent its particular desperate needs or submerge its concern into national concerns. Churchill set out what he called, quote, a perfectly legitimate use of Jewish influence throughout the world to bring pressure, economic and financial, to bear upon the governments which persecute them. It is interesting, too, that he saw a direct parallel between the growing plight of Jewish refugees and British policy to Palestine remarking in April 1937 of the need not to close the doors against them. In Palestine, some 320,000 Jews had availed themselves of Churchill's own legislation of 1922 to immigrate. Now the British government was seeking means of going back on what was known as the Churchill White Paper for Palestine, and effectively giving veto to the Arabs against any substantial further Jewish immigration. And so Churchill, in his discussions with Jewish leaders and with British leaders, stressed the need to maintain an open door in Palestine. The British government, of which he was not a member, but whose conservative-dominated cabinet was made up very much of his colleagues, friends, and contemporaries, people with whom he had worked very closely in the past, took a different view. I found it particularly compelling to see that when one of the greatest British conservative political figures of the time, Lord Halifax, who was shortly to be made Foreign Secretary, went to see Hitler in December 1937, Churchill saw great danger in this. He saw it not only from the general policy of appeasement which he opposed, but also specifically for the dangers it would create for Jews and opponents of Nazism, who would find Hitler encouraged by this British visit and recognition. In the House of Commons, a very hostile House of Commons, which did not want to hear that Lord Halifax's visit to Hitler had been in any way a bad thing. It was all avenues of hope and good Anglo-German relations. Churchill said, "I would like to speak about the persecution of Jews in Germany. It is a horrible thing that a race of people should be attempted to be blotted out of the society in which they had been born. If it were thought by this visit that we were making terms for ourselves at the expenses either of small nations or of large conceptions, which are dear not only to many nations, but to millions of people in every land, a knell of despair would resound through many parts of Europe." It is interesting to note, sad in a way, that Churchill's constant harping on the Jewish issue, as his contemporaries sometimes described his concern, was more and more held against him in the general argument about his lack of reliability, balance, judgment, and statesmanship. Historians today exaggerate his drinking, but at the time, what was disliked was his championing of what we now call human rights, and specifically the rights of Jews. When in May 1939, the British government put on the statute book the limitation of immigration to Palestine, Churchill led the opposition to it in the House of Commons and spoke very bitterly of the policy of closing the gates of refuge at the very moment when they were most needed. But just as his friend had said to me, he was too fond of Jews. So I found a letter at the time of the Kristallnacht, the destruction of Jewish synagogues, property, and lives. A letter in which Neville Chamberlain wrote privately to his sister, "Jews aren't lovable people. I don't care for them myself." Although this expression of opinion killed nobody and hurt nobody physically, it was symptomatic of a terrible malaise which, in enabling the gates of rescue to be closed, did incredible harm in those few months leading up to the outbreak of war. When war came in September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, Churchill was asked by the Zionist leadership, having entered the cabinet as First Lord of the Admiralty, to give his own input to try and prevent the government policy, the 1939 Palestine White Paper policy, from becoming law. And as much as what I'm about to say concerning the period of Churchill's premiership relates to this issue of what was possible and what was not possible, I would like to say very briefly something about this subject. Churchill was under the determination of the conservative government, of which he had become a part, not to alter any of the legislative acts which that government had passed before the outbreak of war, in particular with relation to Palestine, the Jewish refuge. It was pointed out to him correctly from a constitutional point of view that he was not the leader of the Conservative Party. This position was still held by Neville Chamberlain, and that he had not been brought to power by conservative desire, but by the Labour Party's refusal to serve under Chamberlain. The Conservatives had their legislation. It had been voted on. It was in place, and his duty was to conduct the war, not to carry out any retrospective, even a vindictive attitude toward the policies that he, as a maverick, as an outsider, had opposed. I found this in the first of several discussions Churchill had with the Zionist leader, Dr. Weizmann. Weizmann had access to Churchill. They had known each other since the First World War. And in the Weizmann archive, I found very detailed transcripts of everything discussed by the two men. In their first discussion on the 17th of December, 1939, Weizmann pressed Churchill on this matter of the future of Palestine after the war. I would like just to read the few lines that give the crux of this discussion. Dr. Weizmann said to Mr. Churchill, "You stood at the cradle of this enterprise. I hope you will see it through." Mr. Churchill asked what Dr. Weizmann meant by seeing it through. Dr. Weizmann replied that after the war, the Zionists would wish to have a state of some 3 to 4 million Jews in Palestine. Churchill said, "Yes, I quite agree with that." Churchill did agree, but the government of which he was a member continued to seek to appease Arab opinion by giving assurances that Palestine would not be open to Jewish immigration during the war. Indeed, the colonial secretary, Malcolm MacDonald, had specifically refused to issue visas to some 25,000 Polish Jewish children on the grounds that this would be, among other things, though not actually technically a breach of the 1939 White Paper on immigration, be regarded by the Arabs as a breach. Churchill challenged these attitudes. He did so to the increasing annoyance of his colleagues, and while he remained at the Admiralty, in vain. "It seems to me," he told the cabinet on Christmas Day 1939, "that with the world in flux and the life of every European nation and of Britain hanging in the balance, we ought not to say that the sole fixed, immutable fact in the world is that Jewish immigration into Palestine must cease." Even then, even when it came to the trickle of Jews who were managing to make their way to Palestine by what were illegal methods under British law, Churchill was not informed by the Foreign Office or Colonial Office that Admiralty ships for which he was responsible were being used to intercept refugee traffic. When he found it out, he was incensed and immediately brought an end to that practice. I found a private letter which he wrote to Malcolm MacDonald, the colonial secretary, at the beginning of 1940. I was somewhat surprised to see that the telegram about intercepting was sent off without being shown to me. These orders cannot be carried out. Britain was ruled in peace as in war by a vast bureaucratic apparatus. And following this complaint, the civil servants met together and came, after long deliberations which survive in their archives, to the conclusion that the question of Jewish refugees was not a political, but an administrative one, since the political decision to exclude the Jews had already been taken. Therefore, all that remained to be done was to carry it out administratively. This meant that it need not be the subject of memoranda and reports to politicians. In that way, they could get on with it on their own, and no one in the cabinet need know about it. The first person to alert Churchill to what was happening was not therefore a civil servant. They had ganged up in a curious way to keep this information administrative, but his own son, Randolph. It was Randolph who drew his father's attention to a ship which had been intercepted and whose so-called illegal immigrants were to be deported from Palestine to the British Indian Ocean colony of Mauritius. As a result of Randolph's intervention, all those on board the ship were allowed to land and remain in Palestine. Churchill's relationships with his colleagues had to be those of trust. Tremendous pressures and dangers accompanied the war each day, particularly in the first months and years. Yet his stance on the issue of Jewish refugees threatened in several important cases to undermine that trust. I was quite surprised to find a note in the unpublished diary of one of his senior conservative colleagues setting out the reasons why Churchill would be unsuitable as prime minister within 2 days before he assumed that office. In this note, Churchill's support for certain Jewish land purchases in Palestine was regarded as one of the reasons why he would not make a suitable prime minister or a suitable conservative leader. When he did become prime minister, Churchill fought against this attitude. Each of his efforts, each of his fights with officials and with colleagues had to take place, and he never shirked or shunned them within the context of a desperately fought war, a war that was inflicting tremendous casualties through German air bombardment on the British people and even greater casualties at sea with the continuing submarine sinkings. Yet somehow Churchill always seems not only to have made the time, but to have put that extra energy behind the Jewish issues which were brought to him. On 2 occasions, members of his inner staff, fearful that he would react in a positive way to the Jewish requests, deliberately withheld them from him altogether. As it is so topical at the moment and also relevant to my theme, I would like just to make a small comment on the debate as to whether Britain should have made peace with Hitler in the summer of 1940, a view that was first put forward by members of Churchill's cabinet and administration at the time. Churchill was never under any illusions as to the effect which any such peacemaking would have, that it would not be a question of preserving the British Empire, for which Hitler always expressed great admiration, or a question of reaching some accommodation with Germany, whereby Britain would be allowed some form of independence or autonomy, perhaps similar to that of Vichy France or Denmark. He always understood and stressed that it would mean the imposition of the whole racial policy and the destruction of the civilized values, which, as he saw it, was the objective of the Nazi regime. Churchill did understand in October, November 1940, that if the intense bombing of Britain continued to be as effective as it was then, the public might call for an administration which would demand peace with Hitler, almost at the price of annihilation. It was always possible that the bombing would be too severe, that the way forward would not be clear. As he explained on one occasion to President Roosevelt, this could happen. Although the present government and I personally would never fail to send the fleet across the Atlantic if resistance was beaten down here, a point may be reached in the struggle where the present ministers no longer have control of affairs. and when very easy terms could be obtained for the British island by their becoming a vassal state of the Hitler Empire. A pro-German government would certainly be called into being to make peace, and might present to a starving or a shattered nation an almost irresistible case for entire submission to the Nazi will. The Jewish refugee problem entered at the height of this desperate period into Churchill's working life, when an attempt was made by the British commander-in-chief in the Middle East, General Wavell, to deport from Palestine a group of illegal refugees who had entered the country from a ship called the Patria. It's interesting that Churchill had begun to interfere not in the working of the government, but in the movement of correspondence from department to department. He liked to have a look at what his ministers and their advisors were saying to each other, and he found a telegram from General Wavell to Anthony Eden, in which the general said that were Jewish immigrants allowed to remain in Palestine, as the local British administration were prepared to do, this would be a dangerous threat to Britain's position throughout the Middle East in view of the anger it would cause in the Arab countries of the region. Churchill replied directly to General Wavell, pointing out that he had seen this warning from the general, and using a phrase that you do not often hear or see in wartime telegrams. Personally, I hold it would be an act of inhumanity to force these people to re-embark. And Churchill prevented that act of inhumanity. There then began a struggle which lasted until 1943 between Churchill and several government departments who were desperate to prevent any further Jewish refugees from leaving. When one ship went down in the Black Sea, a senior official in the Colonial Office wrote to his superior, "There could have been no more inopportune disaster from the point of stopping any further influx of refugees. It was opportune for British policy that Jews should feel there was a danger in seeking refuge." Churchill tried to set out guidelines for his war cabinet, and they read as follows: "We have to be guided by general considerations of humanity towards those fleeing from the cruelest of persecutions." But the War Cabinet did not accept the Prime Minister's guideline. A substantial majority, as far as I can see, all but one member rejected this guideline. The senior official involved with refugee policy wrote, "We have to remember that our object has been and remains to keep the business as far as possible on the normal administrative plane and outside the realm of cabinet policy and interference." You are familiar in your American government documents with this type of argumentation. Churchill tried to see as much as he could. He constantly badgered his own staff to let him know what was happening. But I found file after file, bundle after bundle of documents which specifically lingered in other offices and other departments. For example, a request on behalf of Luxembourg Jews to find them asylum somewhere in the British Empire, which the officials knew was a subject of interest and concern to the Prime Minister, was deliberately withheld from him. Even at the dangerous climacterics of the war in 1941, the inability of some of Churchill's cabinet colleagues and of the officials behind them even to prioritize the halting of measures to help refugees, even to devote so much time to anti-refugee policy is in our own retrospect and hindsight incredible. Dr. Weitzman went to see Churchill for a second time in March 1941, shortly before the German invasion of Russia. Weizmann, with his access, also had enormous responsibilities. As he saw it, his responsibility was above all to obtain assurances that after the war, Palestine would become a Jewish state. This was the discussion, and Churchill gave the assurances, which he certainly intended to uphold. It looks strange, reading today what was happening inside Europe at that time, to see that Palestine was the priority. But at that time, it was thought that the terrifying experiences through which the Jews of Europe were going would mean that after the war, there would have to be somewhere for them to go. Millions would wish to go to Palestine, certainly to get out of Europe. And Dr. Weizmann felt that his prime responsibility was to that movement of the millions, 2, 3, and even 4 million being mentioned. Churchill's assurances meant a great deal to him. Indeed, it was in Churchill's mind that in recognition of how much those Jews had suffered, not only should they acquire Palestine after the war, but that Palestine itself should have some mandatory area into which the Jews, the victims, could have some recompense, a place to go. He even suggested Libya or possibly Eritrea as a place which might be given to the Jews as their own territory to control, a mandate for a Jewish Palestine. Roosevelt, who was always suspicious of British imperial aspirations, was in dispute with Churchill over this very question of the Jewish national home and sovereign state. The evolution of the Atlantic Charter, with its basic principle of one man, one vote, would have created on the 8th of May, 1945, an Arab state in Palestine. Churchill fought to exclude any of the provisions of the Atlantic Charter from Palestine, so as to enable the Jews not only to settle there, but in due course to become a majority. Of course, this was distracting, if you like, from the conduct of the war, but it focused Churchill's mind on what the Jews were to have and what they were to become after the war. In June 1941, the Germans invaded Russia, and horrifying events began. British intelligence authorities were able to read many dozens of the top secret radio circuits, messages being sent from Germany to the front and from the front to Berlin. Of some 120 circuits, probably 80 or 90 were broken into and read. Among them, in the summer of 1941, were top secret messages sent by the German police forces in the East to Berlin. It is they which first give an idea, not of the full scale of the slaughter in the East, but a clear intimation that it is taking place and taking place on a systematic scale. Between 18 July and 30 August 1941, at least 7 such top secret signals were read by British intelligence. They referred to 4 categories of victims: Jews, Jewish plunderers, Jewish Bolsheviks, and Russian soldiers. They reported, if one adds them up, more than 50,000 executions in an area where we now know many hundreds of thousands of killings were taking place. Churchill was shown these. In a speech in September, he referred to the killings in the East as being unprecedented and barbaric. On 12 September 1941, which was shortly before the Babi Yar executions in Kiev, the chief of the Ordnungspolizei in Berlin gave an instruction that no more information was to be sent by top secret radio messages. I suspect we will never know why he did this. The result was that all subsequent information was sent by telephone, which could not be listened to, or by letter, personal report, and by courier. His small and incomplete window on the Einsatzgruppen killings was closed almost as soon as it had been opened. Only 16 days after the order not to transmit by radio, the Babi Yar executions took place, and 33,000 were murdered in 3 days. Churchill was in dispute at this time with the British Broadcasting Corporation. He had a general view that publicity about the mass murders was essential. The Jewish groups who approached him strongly favored and urged such publicity. But the BBC, in its internal memoranda and in its policy for many months, sought not to emphasize what it called the racial aspects of the killings, not to stress the Jewish aspect. Their internal argument was that this would give some negative propaganda value of showing that Nazis were carrying out mass murder. Yet Churchill persevered with his attempt to make publicity as wide as possible, and eventually both the BBC and the newspapers began to publish quite substantial articles on the killings as they reached the West. The number of refugees who were fleeing by 1942 was very small. Nevertheless, this trickle existed, and even against these few who were able to get out of the totalitarian vice, British policy continued to be one of great reluctance to admit refugees. Churchill now took a decisive initiative to indicate to the Jewish leadership that any Jew fleeing from Nazi rule who could reach a place from which he could proceed to Palestine would be allowed to do so, irrespective of the quotas which existed according to the legislation. Such was the centrality of this debate, and the bitterness in the bulk of the administration against Churchill's attitude, that a special war cabinet was called on 5 March 1942, which laid down an extraordinary basic principle of British policy. All practical steps should be taken to discourage illegal immigration to Palestine. But Churchill, working with a new colonial secretary, Lord Cranborne, devised a system whereby Cranborne's letter to the Jewish Agency gave them the authority, in effect, both to undermine war cabinet policy and also the pre-war policy of the British government. One of the most exhilarating moments in my own research career came as I was working slowly through the bundles of files in the Jewish Agency archive in Jerusalem. Suddenly, I came across Lord Cranborne's letter, the actual letter which he had sent telling the Jewish leaders of the policy which he and Churchill sought to pursue. It seemed to me a letter almost as important as the original Balfour Declaration. There was another area of Jewish desiderata which was particularly strong. It had been launched by Jabotinsky and Weizmann, acting together in 1940, the recruitment of Jews to fight in the Allied forces under a Jewish flag and the Jewish symbol, a Jewish military force. I've always felt that one of the simple and also rather frightening tests of how Churchill's wartime powers were in reality limited is to watch how this Jewish army proposal, which eventually came to fruition, was continuously, year by year, sabotaged and undermined. Churchill also supported the idea, both to show the Jews that they were part of the Allied war effort and to give them some outlet for their feelings, that several dozen young Jews, after joining the British forces in Palestine, would parachute behind German lines to link up with Allied and Jewish resistance in occupied Europe. Most of them perished. Churchill also continued to press his colleagues to enable the Jews to have a military force. So fierce was the opposition to this idea that Churchill was forced to write one of his ministers, I've come to the conclusion that it may be necessary to make an example of anti-Semitic officers in high places. If at least 3 or 4 of them were recalled and dismissed, and the reasons given, it would have a salutary effect. But as you can imagine, the resources of British officialdom, then struggling at one of the most dangerous moments of the Second World War, were mobilized to prevent any such action against any anti-Semitic officers. Although the signals intelligence window into German mass murder activities in the summer of 1941 had closed, from the beginning of the deportations in June 1942, reports of the transportations, many by neutral journalists in Paris, Brussels, and Amsterdam, reached the West immediately. The newspapers for the summer and autumn of 1942 are filled with accounts of the deportation of adults and even children from Western Europe to some unknown destination in the East. Churchill referred to this in a speech in the House of Commons on 8 September 1942, describing the brutal persecutions in which the Germans had indulged in every land into which their armies had broken. These, he said, have recently been augmented by the most bestial, the most squalid, and the most senseless of all their offenses, namely the mass deportation of Jews from France, with the pitiful horrors attendant upon it. When the hour of liberation comes, it will also be the hour of retribution. In that last pledge, Churchill was saying that what the Jewish leadership had been urging the Allies to say for many months: the evildoers would be brought to trial when Germany was defeated. Believing that it would serve perhaps as a deterrent, but specifically as a pointer that Jews would not be denied justice after the war, and that there would be war crimes trials. Following Churchill's speech, the process was begun, which led to the Allied Declaration on War Crimes. All those who participated in the persecution of Jews were warned that after the war they would be hunted down and brought to trial and justice. In calling for this, Churchill and his government and the Jewish leaders were in total agreement. There was another element in the Jewish requests at this time, and a very pressing element. It was that the Allied leaders should speak out about specific persecution of the Jews. Those who have studied this period know that most Allied declarations referred, for one reason or another, to the general persecution of those under Nazi rule, and there was persecution of every subject people. There was in London a Czech government in exile, so clearly the Lidice massacre was the subject of such a declaration. There was a Polish government in exile, so the murder of as many as 3 million non-Jewish Poles was constantly the subject of declarations. The Jews did not have a government in exile, nor any form of government. They did have representatives, and my impression, having studied many hundreds of files, is that their representatives worked exceptionally hard, without respite, to bring the plight of the Jews to the attention of the political and military leadership and of the public. Central to these efforts during 1942 to 1943 was the desire for publicity, for noise, for senior people to say what was happening. It is interesting that many senior British and American politicians were reluctant to introduce the specific question of Jewish suffering. One exception was the Polish government exile in London, whose leader, Count Brzezinski, constantly referred to the Jewish plight in his news, film, and radio presentations. The other exception was Churchill, who lost no opportunity at public gatherings to draw his audience's attention to this. I would just like to read one example from October 1942. The systematic cruelties to which the Jewish people, men, women, and children, have been exposed under the Nazi regime are among the most terrible events of history. Free men and women denounce these vile crimes, and when this world struggle ends with the enthronement of human rights, racial persecution will be ended. Churchill's words served as a great rallying point for Jews in the West and culminated in the public declaration of 17 December 1942 against Nazi crimes. In the course of my researches, I found that many members of the British government and the United States administration sought to water down this declaration about the nature of crimes being committed. Churchill was emphatic that these should not be a declaration of what was thought to be happening or what might be happening, which is what the State Department wanted to say, but what was actually happening. His bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination was the phrase used. And the declaration reiterated the request of the Jewish leadership that when the war was over, all those committing these crimes would be hunted down and brought to trial. Just to show you the difficulty of such declarations, which to us sound powerful but self-evident, an attempt to enlist the support of the Pope in this declaration failed. The Cardinal Secretary of State at the Vatican replied to the British government, "While we deplore the cruelties that have come to our attention, we are unable to verify Allied reports." Thus, they would not join the declaration. Throughout 1943, Churchill sought to respond to the request from the Jewish leadership to continue the pressure on the Germans to realize that their responsibility would be held to account. Leaflets in which this was set out were prepared and dropped by the Royal Air Force over Germany. There were already some small film clips of what had been happening in Germany in 1938 to 39. These were made into a film, which at Churchill's insistence was shown to all United States servicemen beginning to gather in Britain during 1943 for the invasion of Europe in 1944. On 24th of July, 1943 at Chequers, Churchill discussed the war with two of his guests, the Air Ace Wing Commander Guy Gibson and his wife Eve. Churchill wanted Gibson to go on a goodwill tour of Canada and the United States. Eve Gibson later recalled, "We were shown a film captured from the Germans depicting the atrocities inflicted on the Jews and inhabitants of the occupied countries. It was quite ghastly, and the Prime Minister was very, very moved. He told me that it was shown to every American serviceman arriving in this country." During my Churchill researches, I found an account of a lunch which he had in April 1943 with the Spanish ambassador in London. During the lunch, Churchill brought up the recent closing by Spain of the Pyrenees frontiers to Jews who were seeking to escape from France. "I must warn your government," Churchill told the ambassador, "that if you prevent these unfortunate people seeking safety from the horrors of Nazi domination, such a thing will never be forgotten and will poison the relations between the Spanish and the British people." Churchill then enlisted Roosevelt's help to put pressure on Spain. At first, Roosevelt was reluctant to participate, but in the end, he agreed. Having to argue this case at a very difficult and dangerous moment of the war, with great military forces in violent contention, both in Europe and in the Far East, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, "Our immediate facilities for helping the victims of Hitler's anti-Jewish drive are so limited that surely the ability of removing some of them to safety is all the more incumbent upon us. In March 1944, the German government ordered the occupation of Hungary. Germany was then under pressure from the Red Army in the east and was fearful that Hungary would defect from the Axis and become a soft underbelly for a Soviet thrust. With the German occupation of Hungary began the rapid rounding up of Jews into ghettos and the preparation for their even more rapid deportation to Auschwitz. 5 prisoners escaped from Auschwitz in order to bring news to the West of what was happening to the Jews there. 4 were Jews. 1 was a Polish Catholic medical student. The moment their information reached the West, the moment the unknown destination was revealed as Auschwitz and the truth of the gas chambers there made clear, there was a tremendous and understandable outcry. The impact of their report on the Jewish and non-Jewish world was dramatic and traumatic. Immediately, an exceptional flurry of activity began in an attempt to do something to save those Hungarian Jews who had been or were about to be deported. The 2 most senior members of the Jewish Agency, Dr. Weizmann and Foreign Minister Moshe Chertoff, apprised of this information, went personally to London. The agency was the British appointed liaison between the Jews in Palestine and the British government. On the 6th of July, 1944, in a meeting with Anthony Eden, Weizmann and Chertoff made 5 urgent and desperate suggestions. The first was that the Allies should publish a declaration expressing their readiness to admit Jewish refugees, or as they call them, fugitives, from any territory into the neutral countries, Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, and Turkey, to give what was called temporary shelter to those escaping the massacres. Eden and the British government responded immediately and with alacrity to this request. The second suggestion was that those governments with diplomatic representation in Hungary should be asked to request their representatives in Budapest to issue protective documents for the Jews of Hungary. From 9th of July, 3 days later, Raoul Wallenberg began issuing his protective documents in Budapest. The third request, which was acceded to immediately, was that a stern warning be issued, published and broadcast to Hungarian officials, railwaymen, and the Hungarian population in general, that anyone convicted of having taken part in the roundup of Jews or their deportation would be considered a war criminal and treated accordingly. Again, one sees the tremendous reliance on and belief in the war criminal path towards halting war crimes, that if people knew they would be brought to trial as war criminals, they would cease their crimes. To this, the British government acceded immediately. Broadcasts were made in Hungarian to Hungary. Those participating in deportations will be treated as war criminals. The fourth of the 5 proposals, made with such urgency on receipt of the facts about Auschwitz, was that Stalin, whose forces were in the Carpathians, should be asked to issue a similar warning on Hungary on behalf of the Soviet Union. Not only was this acceded to, but when Anthony Eden showed this request to Churchill, Churchill himself drafted a declaration for Stalin to issue in Moscow, in which it was stated that, among other things, that the Red Army and retribution would enter Hungary together. The 5th and final request of the Jewish Agency was that, quote, the railway line leading from Budapest to Birkenau and the death camp at Birkenau and other places should be bombed. When Churchill was shown this request by Eden, he did something I've never seen on any other document submitted to Churchill for his approval. He wrote on it what he wanted done. Normally, he would have said, bring this up to the War Cabinet on Wednesday, or let us discuss this with the Air Ministry. Instead, he wrote to Eden on the morning of the 7th of July. Is there any reason to raise this matter with the cabinet? Get anything out of the Air Force you can and invoke me if necessary. I've never seen a minute of Churchill's giving that sort of immediate authority to carry out a request. Churchill's meeting of July 7th gave Eden the full authority of the Prime Minister to follow up the request to bomb the railway lines to Auschwitz. 2 days later, the deportations on the railway lines from Hungary to Auschwitz ceased, and the priority of the surviving Jews of Hungary and of all those concerned with them in the West, Jews and governments alike, was the issue of protective documents to enable them to find some place where they might have a safe haven. There is a vast subtext of which I have written in my book, Auschwitz and the Allies. The British officials did not know on 9 July that the deportations had ceased, so they had to deal with the Prime Minister's request on the assumption that it still had some validity. And in the course of dealing with it, some of them revealed considerable distaste for carrying out any such instruction. It is interesting, however, to note that when the request was put to the American Air Force commander, General R. Eaker, when he visited the Air Ministry a few days later, he gave it his full support. He regarded it as something that the American daylight bombers could and should do. But when the request reached Washington, indeed on the 5 separate occasions when the request reached Washington, it was turned down. On the second occasion that it reached the Undersecretary for War, John J. McCloy, he told his assistant to kill it, and it was then effectively killed. The debate about bombing those particular lines continued for more than a month after the lines were no longer in use. I spoke to a number of those who would have been involved in bombing the lines, as Churchill had wished, and even bombing the camp installations had the deportations not stopped. One thing which greatly heartened me from my perspective, from my window as a Jew, was that all the pilots and aircrew I spoke to who would have had to do the work were emphatic that they would have done it and were ashamed and angry that they had not been asked to do it. I even found the young man who had taken that aerial photograph of the camp, a South African photo reconnaissance pilot. He was in extreme distress at the thought that on the 4 separate occasions when he flew over the camp with his camera, he had no idea what it was he was flying over. He flew only an unarmed plane, but as he said to me very touchingly, had I known, I could at least have tipped my wing to show the people there that someone knew they were there. Churchill had no doubt that a terrible crime had been committed. As he wrote to Anthony Eden on the day that the escapees' account of the truth about Auschwitz and the unknown destination reached him. There is no doubt that this is probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world, and it has been done by scientific machinery, by nominally civilized men in the name of a great state and one of the leading races of Europe. It is quite clear that all concerned in this crime, who may fall into our hands, including the people who only obeyed orders by carrying out the butcheries, should be put to death after their association with the murders has been proved. Declarations should be made in public so that everyone connected with it will be hunted down and put to death. Martin's talk ends here. I'd like to finish with one final quote, which I think defines Churchill's fault of being too fond of Jews. I'm against preventing Jews from doing anything which other people are allowed to do. I'm against that, and I have the strongest abhorrence of the idea of anti-Semitic lines of prejudice. And Martin's book, Churchill and the Jews, which is the long answer to what you've heard. Thank you. And let me try and stop sharing.
Thank you, Esther.
I've
Thank you
done
so
it.
much. You've done it. You've survived. Most of our viewers will not know this, but Esther is actually suffering from a sore throat. So I think congratulations are in order
My
for
teeth.
making it through that lecture. You did brilliantly, and I'm really grateful that you did. So thank you. On a personal note, I just wanted to say how wonderful it is to read in the chat messages from people who had that personal connection with Sir Martin and his work. And that's something that I hear time and again at the centre. It's very heartening hearing of the generosity of spirit that he had to assist others in their research. And so it's really lovely to welcome you back to continue to share his work, Esther. And I hope you'll continue to do the same. There are a lot of you here, so I'm working my way through the chat, the messages, and the private messages. So please bear with me. To kick things off, I just wanted to ask quite a simple question, Esther, and I think the answer to this was at the screenshot in your PowerPoint on the first slide. But when was this lecture given?
It was given in 1993.
Oops, sorry, I lost you a minute
sorry,
there.
sorry. It was given on the 8th of November, 1993.
Okay.
It was the International Churchill Society's 25th anniversary international conference held at the Holocaust Museum.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's amazing. So we've had a
So
real snapshot of
unfortunately,
history.
timely.
Yeah. Yeah. And you answered this also. This was another question. For those who would like to find out more about this topic, is there any particular reading you'd recommend aside from Churchill and the Jews, as you finished your talk there?
On Martin's website, martingilbert.com, if you search Auschwitz, there are many different pieces by him that I've put up. The first one, in fact, that I put up, which is at the end, as you scroll through, is I think Fact and Myth on the bombing of Auschwitz, and it gives in detail the points that the Jewish leadership asked the British government to enact. No, I mean, all of the books, and there were bits of it, which is why I was so thrilled when I found this lecture, which was really a gift to me because it saved me time, and he covers everything in it. And as I say, sadly, the information is still relevant. On a lighter note, for those who are interested in how the British government works or worked at that time, on YouTube are wonderful videos of Yes Minister, which it was a British program on the government. And if you check the Israel-Arab conflict, there's great discussion that really echoes what Churchill was up against at that time.
Brilliant, thank you. This has been asked a number of times. Is there a published version of this lecture?
It is in the I put the cover on the proceedings of the I don't know if it's available.
Okay.
But it is now out there, and once you post the link for it, it is out there. But
okay.
In such a succinct manner, I haven't found. I don't know.
Perfect. So there's not currently a transcript of it online available, but right. As you say, this talk will be out there.
Yeah, and it's a long piece, but there are different bits of it that I put on the website.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So David asks, did Churchill ever express any regrets for his actions taken or not taken while the Holocaust was happening?
Sorry, David, can I have a last name?
I don't think I've made a note, but I don't think I recorded a last name. I'm sorry.
Okay. Did he express any regret?
Did Churchill express any regret?
He, I, he was he was fighting continually all the way through, and he did what he could.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting books which I didn't show is The Will of the People by Martin, Churchill and Parliamentary Democracy, in which Martin describes why he didn't win the election, why he was elected, not elected into office in 1945. So that explains what happens, and as he told his wife, it's the will of the people, the realities of democracy. But I don't know about specific regrets, other than it was something that he continually worked toward.
And Ken, sorry, I haven't written down surnames, so that's my fault. But Ken asked, why do we think that Churchill made no reference to or very little reference to the Holocaust in his own memoirs, given that we know from Sir Martin's biography that he called it, the greatest crime in the history of civilization?
I'm not a Churchill scholar. I should have said that at the beginning. And there probably are people in the audience who are. What I can remember from what Martin told me was that he had a lot of help writing his memoirs. So there were researchers, first of all. And secondly, the Holocaust didn't have a name. It wasn't called the Holocaust until 20 years later. Martin told me that it was the television production called Holocaust, in which the name actually then became associated with what had happened to the Jews. Martin's first book on the Holocaust, Final Journey, he told me it's called Final Journey because the name Holocaust hadn't been used in connection with that. So I think it was an issue that it wasn't a name, it wasn't a topic. Although certainly in the biography, as he was running the war, day by day, there are things that he did to alleviate the situation for Jews. I hope that answers the question. It probably doesn't, but there are Churchill scholars who would know more than I.
There's lots of experts in the room today, which is very exciting to welcome you all. I'm just seeing if there are any final questions. Do feel free to post them in the chat if you've got any. I'm going to thank you again, Esther, because that was,
Dr. Irene Lancaster has raised
Oh, we've got a raised hands. Let me see if I can work out the logistics of this. Okay, I think I can unmute you. Just a second. Does that work?
Yes. Hello. Hello. I've been a bit assertive in the website, so I'm going to be very nice here because it's the first time I've been. I am an expert on that era of Jewish history, particularly Weizmann. I met your husband about 5 times. The first time in 1983 in Israel, when there was so much of an audience that we were out the door in the Van Leer Centre. And I spoke to him together with the former chief rabbi of Ireland, who had just made Aliyah, thanks to his very hospitable community who'd paid for an apartment for them. And he said how much he thought Israel was the answer, really, to everything. And I met him again when I was teaching at Liverpool University and then Manchester. And I just wanted to say that I think somebody said this, although the word Holocaust, although I am surprised, wasn't always used, people knew that it was destruction of 2/3 of the Jews, in Europe. And also, I've always recommended your husband's books and used them myself as a novelty, actually, because I've taught for a very long time, because they're so factual, quite dry in the best academic word, and I love statistics, even though I do poetry. And he is by far the best historian in the English tradition that I have met. However, this doesn't mean that people can put in threads things that are very anti-Israel and very upsetting to people like me, because I've got a daughter in Israel with your name, Esther, who has just been displaced and does nothing but help everybody in the country. She's just been displaced in her own country. So, you know, Churchill was by far the greatest Englishman. There's no doubt about it. And Israelis think that more than anybody else. But that doesn't mean that he always got everything right. And he was the MP in my area of Manchester, and we love him very much. So I think Bethany is also Northern. I hope I haven't made a mistake from your voice. And we are, and thank you very much for your, you know, for your lecture. And my dad, you know, escaped Poland and was stationed in Canada during the Holocaust, where he joined the army here. And he could have stayed in Canada, but he came back to save all the other Jews, which, you know, so as I say, I think some of the thread was pretty nasty against the Jewish community, and unnecessarily so. Okay, thank you very much, Esther. Sorry to go on.
No, thank you. Thank you. I agree with you. He's my favorite historian too, but then I'm
no, you're biased.
I'm prejudiced, so it's nice to have a professional.
No, I mean, I recommended it to people in Israel as well because of the maps and everything, and Russia and all those places. Totally painstaking. And I mean, some historians now are rubbish. In fact, people like Andrew Roberts and Charles Moore as well on Thatcher, much better, and they're journalists really, than the average historian. I mean, they're completely, and they are in his thing. I mean, he's a very, very great historian, and it was lovely meeting him, and that huge audience that was out the door on the Russian Jews. So you should be very proud of him, and, you know, be lovely to meet you someday.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. We have a couple more raised hands. So if you're happy, Esther, if the throat is holding up, and Dr. Lancaster, you're right. I am from the other side of the Pennines, though. I'm from Yorkshire. So David, I've asked you to unmute. I don't know if that's working.
Hello. Good evening. Video seems to have been a bit odd, but just now. I think we met in Skokie.
Yes. Yes, we met in London also.
Yes, indeed, at your home. So the point I wanted to make was verbally for anyone who's listening, apart from the two of us, is that I think Martin spoke about, explained to me on that occasion when I asked a question about the possibility, which I've not seen anything written about, that maybe accurate bombing by aircraft could have hit the railway bridges over gorges between Hungary and Birkenau, which is interesting. As I said in a later note, another historian explained to me once when I quoted Martin Gilbert that the challenges of setting up a successful, accurate bombing operation took a lot of preparation and couldn't be done quickly, which seems to me to be logical and convincing. So I think people are able to fight other people's battles with hindsight very well, but weren't necessarily equipped to do so at the time. And there were lots of Jewish very brave combatants who joined the British Army, including in the 30 Troop, the volunteers that Helen Fry wrote about, who had to change their names and all the other sorts of things because of the extraordinary risk that they were running. Thank you for your talk tonight. Hope this is helpful to confirm what you were actually saying, but this is from my memory, which is not necessarily 100%.
Thank you. There was an issue about pinpoint bombings, and Martin said had they bombed the railway lines, they would have been repaired immediately. And it has become an emotional issue, sort of everything focused on that. And it's one of those things, I think, where we all feel frustrated, or people at the time felt frustrated, and whether it would have made a difference. I think also part of the discussion about that if the Germans felt that the West was bombing the camp, that the West also wanted the Jews dead. So there was, you know, that issue. But yeah,
I believe that one of the bases for the RAF Wartime Photographic Interpretation Unit was a building in Highgate, and which I find quite ironical. But there was something I read once of the possibility of the photographic interpretation of the photos taken before and after the intended target, because I think that the camera came on too long, or was on after the intended target in that flight, that photographed people in Auschwitz. That's obviously a highly sensitive matter. But thank you very much, and good wishes to you.
and you.
Thank you, David. And Harriet, I will ask you to unmute. I hope that will work. I don't know, we've got our hands raised for Harriet, but maybe, oh, no. Okay, I don't know if Harriet wishes to ask anything, but I'll assume not. So I don't see
If Richard Langworth is here, I don't know where. If I think he put in the chat that he has published these proceedings. I don't know whether that, are they available, Richard? Can you unmute? He's not there. Can you unmute and tell us if they're available? The proceedings of the International Churchill Society.
It may have had to have jet off somewhere. I see, Anthony, you have your hand up, so I will unmute you and we'll see if anyone gets in touch.
Yes, good evening. I will be brief, but Esther, as you know, I recently joined the Centre as a trustee, and want to thank you so much for giving a very lucid presentation on what quite rightly was a very special Churchill attribute, which, as you say, his biggest enemies were within the British government. He spent as much time fighting them as he had to the Germans. And we're so delighted that you could throw so much light on it. And as you know, we're hoping, and Bethany might provide more details, that a member of the Churchill family will be coming to spend an evening with us in April. But I'll leave that to Bethany. But I just wanted to personally thank you for bringing so much of this to life and translating across the ideas then to what we're going through at the moment is fascinating, because you really wonder whether in fact history does more than rhyme.
Indeed. Thank you. When I was with Martin and we would meet people, they would turn to me and say, "Are you a writer also?" And I used to say, "No, I'm a reader." I had no idea that it would become a something that I would do. But it started with reading to my grandchildren, and then I thought, Martin's work is so available and so lucid and so important that if there's a way to and this so whatever was good in this talk came from Martin. I just transmitted it. But thank you.
You do a brilliant job, Esther. You're a great speaker, and we really love hosting you. So thank you very much. And as Anthony teased you with there, we will be hosting a talk with a member of the Churchill family and some other speakers in person, and hopefully also online on a similar topic on Churchill and the Jews. So stand by to hear more in due course. It'd be lovely to welcome some of you there. I see we are having technical problems getting Richard to unmute. If you could use the raise hand function, then you'll pop up on my screen and I'll be able to unmute you. But for now, Harriet, I see you. I'll ask you to unmute and see if that works. Oh, sorry.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. I've tried 3 different devices so that I could do it. There are, I guess, 3 things I want to say. Number 1, when my students, it was College of St. Elizabeth, it became St. Elizabeth University in New Jersey, read Martin's books, they agreed with me that he was a historian with a heart. He not only shared what he learned about Churchill's role in the Holocaust, but also the individual survivors' stories. And I've met many of them. His book, The Boys, includes Pinchas Gutter, who has spoken to my students many times, and I've traveled with him many times. And I think that he stands apart from many other historians because it was not only his extraordinary intelligence and ability to convey what he learned, but also his heart that brought this about. And I'm really grateful to Esther and to you for making it possible for younger scholars and teachers to know about him. 2 questions I have are, the first time I heard him speak at Yad Vashem, he had no notes. And I think he spoke, and when he came to St. Elizabeth, he did not seem to have any written notes. It is possible he had them, but I don't know. So maybe Esther can tell us about this talk that she has just given us from what he clearly had notes for, how often he spoke without notes in such a clear, concise, well-documented way. So that is the first thing that I want to ask. And second, whether any of his talks that were recorded are available for us to see, to hear his beautiful voice sharing what he had to say.
Thank you, Harry. It's lovely to see you, and thank you for being here. There are talks on YouTube. And I have a filmography page on the website. So there are some talks around available. In terms of whether he used notes, he did use notes. He had, in fact, he would have a stack of papers, and sometimes he gave his talks chronologically, but if he ran out of time, he just stopped. Sometimes he'd be turning pages, and I kept thinking, but people will wonder what you're missing, what you're skipping. So he did have notes, and in fact, often he would know the material so well that he would get up and I said, you don't need the notes. Just make a couple words and speak from that, which he did a bit. And then after he became ill and then died, I thought, why did I tell him to do that? Because these lectures are so important. So he gave this lecture, I would think, from notes. And then when Richard Langworth wanted to publish them, he would have then made his notes into more of something that's readable. Although it's interesting because he really involves himself in his research in this, which he doesn't do in his writing in general. So he did have notes, and he said that he never gave the same talk twice. He would target each talk to the audience. So it may have seemed like he didn't. It's possible that he didn't. But in general, most of the lectures that I was lucky to attend with him, he had his notes, and he was glued to them. He would go to freshen up or whatever, and I said, let me hold on. Oh, no, he's glued to it. So I don't know, but it's wonderful to see you, and thank you. And Pinchas Gutter, who Harriet mentioned, is a survivor from South Africa from Poland, and then South Africa, and now Canada. A dear friend who was also one of the boys whose story is in Martin's book, The Boys.
I just wanted to say 2 other things. One, and that is Martin's writing so inspired me that while I did take my students on several trips on the March of Remembrance and Hope and other trips with survivors, I always wanted to plan my own. And so Pinka Scooter came with me with my students. A documentary filmmaker came on that trip, Lisa Resnick, and she's made a film called A Holocaust Journey. And Esther gave us permission to use the Holocaust Journey because Martin wrote a book based upon his own trip with his own students and survivors that is very inspiring. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And the last thing is to speak about Martin's humanity and his wonderful personality. When he came to St. Elizabeth, right after I met him at Yad Vashem, this was in October of 1991, one of the sisters who had been the chairperson of the history department came to him, and she had his book, Churchill, A Life, and also his book, The Holocaust, which ripped out the hearts of all of us when we read that. She brought those books to him, and he looked at her, and she said, "Would you autograph this for me?" And he said, "I not only will autograph it, but I will do so with the same pen with which I wrote them." And he took out a fountain pen and he signed it, and she was just thrilled. I mean, it was really wonderful. At that time in 91, he was not on email. He was not on the computer. He told me his sons were trying to get him onto that. And I assumed that he did eventually. So he didn't have to write everything with his pen. Thank you, Esther, for doing this.
Thanks, Harriet. And I just want to add that Holocaust Journey is coming out in a new edition in the UK, at least in February. So that's very exciting. And Rob Rinder has written a foreword for it. He's a grandchild of one of the boys. So that's very exciting to finally have a new edition of Holocaust Journey. It is an important book. Thank you. I just have to get, if there's more, my electric source to my computer just disappeared. So I keep going. I'm here. I'm listening.
No problem.
I just need to get it. Otherwise, we're going to go.
The perils of live
Indeed.
talks on Zoom. Well, I'm happy to say that I think, Richard, we've managed to get you unmuted. It'd be great if you could update us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. A couple of things. The note about, did Martin use notes? The first speech I heard him make was at the Waldorf Hotel in London in 1985. And the subject was Churchill's London. And we had made the mistake of having dinner first, so he got very late. And as time went by, I saw Martin looking at his watch. And in his briefcase, he had an open briefcase next to him, filled with pieces of yellow A4 foolscap sheets. And on each one was written only a single line, with his famous fountain pen. And when he would make a speech, he would pull out one of these sheets. They were all in order. Pull it out, take a glance at it, throw it aside, and then go on for 10 minutes completely without any notes at all. And so as the time went on, I saw him chucking out these sheets. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Look, it's 10 o'clock at night. We'll never get done here. I'm thinning out my speech." We said, "No, we don't want that. We want the full unabridged edition, no matter how late it goes." And that's how I saw Martin speak. It was tremendous extemporaneous performance. There are videos of him speaking at Hillsdale College on winstonchurchill.hillsdale.edu. Just search for the Hillsdale College Churchill Project. And when you get on the site, type Martin, search for Martin Gilbert, and away you go. Likewise, on my website is my piece about Martin when he died, and it tells all about that speech at the Waldorf Hotel. The text that Esther read from is available. If you can't get it anywhere else from me by email, just email richard@langworth.name, and I'll email you a copy. That was published in the Proceedings of the International Churchill Societies, 1992 to 93, which is long out of print, but you can probably get used copies on bookfinder.com or maybe even Amazon. Did I answer everything? I think so. Does that help?
Very much so. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. You've made many people very happy with that, I think, judging by the requests we had. Esther, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Thank you all for coming, and may we have better times and it's become part of history and not repeating.
Well, I would like to echo that and to thank everybody for coming. We had a stellar performance from Esther and a bumper turnout, so that's wonderful. Thank you, Esther, very much for doing that for us. Before you all go, I would encourage you to sign up for our future talks. You can find out all about them on our website, the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre website. And our next talk is on the 31st of January, and it's entitled Cashing Out, World War II and the Flight of Nazi Treasure. So I think that sounds really excellent. I hope you agree, and I hope you'll join us there. But for now, I will just say thank you and good night.